Ringer Dish is the place for all things celebrity, from major celebrity moments like the Met Gala and the Oscars, to the weird habits of the stars you love, to refreshers on the biggest tabloid stories from the last 20 years. Ringer Dish has all the vital details. On Tuesdays, catch Jam Session with Juliette Littman and Amanda Dobbins for royal family rumors, celebrity real estate, and industry analysis. And on Fridays, listen to Tea Time with me, Kate, and Amelia for lightning-fast coverage on pressing celebrity news and gossip. Check out Ringer Dish on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Anytime Fitness. We may talk a whole lot about sports, but when it comes to keeping fit ourselves, there's definitely room for improvement. I hit this point early July. I was just like, I am not in good enough shape. I started trying to walk at least 15,000 steps a day, or hiking, or just anything to keep my legs moving. Now it's the end of 2023. I feel great. I had a physical 3 weeks ago, and the guy was like, "You're doing great. You're doing better than you were 3 years ago." I felt great. Whatever your goals are, progress is possible thanks to Anytime Fitness. Get a personalized plan and support from an expert coach anytime, anywhere. Visit anytimefitness.com to try Anytime Fitness for free. Start to train for your life. Terms, conditions, and restrictions apply. See website for details.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day. And that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
I need sports to have to clear the room. Stand up and walk now.
Hello and welcome to The Watch. My name is Chris Ride. I am an editor at TheRinger.com, and joining me on the other line, wherever he sits, it's the chef's table. It's Andy Greenwald.
What a kindness. What a kindness.
Oh, what's up, man? It's Thursday, so we were recording our Top Chef show today. We also have a really fun interview that I did with For All Mankind co-creator Ron Moore, who people may know from his work on Outlander and Battlestar Galactica and various Star Trek offshoots, Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. Ron, Battlestar is one of my favorite shows ever. As I've sort of said earlier in the year, For All Mankind definitely just took a huge leap for me in the second season. I loved the second season. If folks haven't had a chance to catch up, or if maybe they wavered a little bit in the first season, I would highly recommend checking out the second season. It's pretty rare that you see a show just jump up like that. It was always very good, but I think it's great now. So I'm really excited. That's in the second half of our talk. We're going to talk about last night's Restaurant Wars episode of Top Chef. But Andy, how are you doing?
I'm good. But I want to turn it around to you because, not to blow up your spot, but Chris is on the East Coast currently.
I am. I'm in Philadelphia visiting my mom.
And lots of love to your mom, first of all, from the whole Watch fam, which is just me in a room right now, and Kaya, I assume. What's it like? What's it like being back on the streets? I notice you're experiencing humidity for the first time in a year and a half.
I mean, longer, because I usually come back at Christmas. So it's been a minute since your boy felt the sweet smell of Philadelphia sewers that haven't been rained on in a minute. But you know what? It's been awesome. It's been awesome to just walk around. It's been awesome to see different people, different streets. I would say that my Philadelphians definitely, it seems like they've just been like eating potatoes in a dark room for 12 and a half months. And now they're back out and they're ready to have their Belgian wheat beers at any given moment of the day. But I support it, and I'm right behind them, you know?
I mean, to be fair, I think eating potatoes in a cold room is how I spent the months between November and April for the majority of my life. So right. I don't think it's pandemic related.
That's just Eagle season.
That's right. That's right. You don't even, at a certain point, you don't even need to cook the potatoes. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, you're so locked in. I get it.
Before we get into Top Chef, I did want to hit one thing, although I am surprising you with it.
Okay.
Did you notice that almost directly after we recorded our podcast on Monday, and we talked a lot about the AT&T Discovery Warner Media deal, it was announced that Amazon is in talks to buy MGM for quite a few $1 billion. That would be quite a momentous purchase from Amazon. Although I think if I was going to spend a couple of $1 billion on a media property, I don't know if MGM would be number one on my list to go to, but it's got some very valuable stuff.
It's a veil. That's the main thing. I mean, if you ever had a day when like maybe you get a surprise like paycheck or a bonus paycheck, or maybe your mom greases your palm with a couple 20s and you're like, this is burning a hole in my pocket.
Go down to the store and get yourself a blow pop.
But it's a very dangerous feeling to be like, I want to spend this money. And then you see what they have at the store and you don't really want it, but that's what's there. That's not fair. I mean, there are a lot of compelling reasons why this might make some sense. But it isn't necessarily the most natural fit. I will start by saying, remember a few months ago when we were kind of going through how the pandemic had affected major media properties and what was still on the shelf, what was being held, how things were being finagled. And the biggest question mark, well, it began as a question mark. I think it actually was kind of a declarative end of a sentence, was what was going to go on with the new Bond movie. And the answer was nothing. They're going to release this in theaters.
And there was a conversation about whether or not Apple might buy it, right?
Exactly. Because that kind of made sense. It fits into their overall programming strategy of let's make stuff people like, we hope. Right. But MGM does not have a natural connection to a streaming service the way the Warner Brothers movies could be just put on HBO Max or the Disney movies on Disney Plus, obviously. There was also just, at the end of the day, the price point for a single movie that would eventually be available for an exclusive window for a major motion picture made no sense. It made no sense for Amazon or anyone, Apple, to shell out a ton of money for one movie in a long-running series that they would lose exclusivity to. And frankly, it made no sense for MGM, which, unlike these not leveraged but spread out businesses, needs to make a mint on a Bond movie in order to continue to exist. And now this seems to have turned into a larger negotiation.
Yeah, I don't know what. So one thing that sort of pops up occasionally when you read about these mergers, and as we've seen, is these streaming services launch, and then you're like, oh, fam, you launched Paramount Plus and Yellowstone's not on it. Or, you know what I mean? Like there are still like lots of complicated deals, independent studios or, production shingles of studios that make shows and then maybe sell those shows to other places. So there's a lot of complications. I don't know necessarily that Amazon buys MGM and then the next day they can do the Bond expanded universe long form series is like maybe they're doing around the Jack Ryan, Tom Clancy verse, but I don't know that they can't.
I think that specifically that's an odd one because the movies are distributed by MGM. They're controlled by the Broccoli family, which still sounds made up, but Barbara Broccoli, I believe the daughter of the elder Broccoli, whose name I'm blanking on.
Albert R. Broccoli. Yeah.
Yes. What a cool name. Are the longtime stewards of the franchise, right? And so they would have to sign off on anything involving Bond. That said, this is a lot of money. Amazon has deep pockets. Anything is workable. And I guess the idea is, that was the thing that stood out to me too. It's Amazon makes movies already. They don't necessarily need another studio. So what are they getting out of this? And the article's kind of led with, it's the deep bench of titles and IP, which you could look at two ways. You could look at it as the way all the studios are, which is everything in our library is potentially developable into something that can make us money today. It's just a question of hooking it up with the right talent. That's what every studio is doing. I know this from personal experience, and we also know it because look at the output on the Marvel and non-Marvel output on Disney Plus. And that bench includes some, fairly well-known properties. Bond, I saw, they made the Fargo show, they make the Handmaid's Tale show as well. The second piece of it, I think that's worth noting, is the library play, which is to say that the movies that are on Amazon doesn't, other than the movies that it itself has made in the last few years, Amazon doesn't have its own bench of things just to populate its library forever the way Disney does, or Warner Brothers has one of the best ones. It's one of the things that, is a low-key selling point for HBO Max. By MGM, now they do. Now when you scroll through Prime, there are a bunch of movies, some very beloved, that are just not going to go away. And I think they see value in that.
Yeah. I don't, Amazon is one of the sort of strangest propositions in this whole streaming wars landscape because, Apple is a tech company and Apple is a hardware company. And so everything I think it does is sort of not necessarily an act of vanity, but is sort of like, yeah, we could do this, we could not do it. For Amazon, I'm always just like, I'm not really sure why you guys need to do this. Obviously they're spending a tremendous amount of money. If they spend $500 million on Lord of the Rings and they spend $7 or $8 billion on MGM, this is something that they're really serious about. That's not chump change. So it'll be really fascinating to see how that plays out, which is what I say at the end of every conversation we have about Hollywood news. Why don't we get into Top Chef? Because we have this Ron Moore interview coming up in the second half, and it was Restaurant Wars, which is usually the climax before the climax of every season. It's the merge in Survivor. It's Restaurant Wars in Top Chef, and it was, I would say, pretty shocking. While a microcosm of the way the season has gone in general, I think I was pretty surprised by the final result.
I love this episode. I want to start by saying that. Like, I know that, the fourth episode of Years and Years was exceptional. Mare has had a couple of bangers. We've been lost in Le Bureau. This hour of Top Chef is one of the most purely pleasurable things that I've seen all year. I devoured it, pun intended. It was so great, and it was great on so many levels. One was, it was just great that the show can innovate. I just shout out to the Magical Elves and all the people who make the show year after year. They do not get stuck in ruts, and they clearly saw the challenges of this pandemic season as opportunities, because this was one of the most noteworthy and fascinating and entertaining Restaurant Wars in the history of the show. And at no point did I feel like it was less than, because there wasn't the scene where they yell at the servers who were trucked in, to fold napkins for them, or there wasn't the scene of the people jammed up at the maitre d' stand. This was so much more intense and focused, and really, I think, ultimately kind of more respectful of the talent of these chefs, and that it shined a brighter light on some of their deficiencies. So I loved it on a production level. But I also loved it. I know you had our friend Sean on podcast last week, and talking about, does the show have a villain problem by not having one? This was the purest expression of Top Chef for me, where everyone got along wonderfully and supported each other, and the things that did them in were their own flaws, mistakes, and deficiencies. They were their own villains in this episode, and I found that so much more compelling on a human level than had there been one great asshole in the kitchen whacking people over the head with a ladle, figuratively or literally.
This is one of the first Restaurant Wars that I remember being like, they've won based on the concept.
Oh yeah.
As soon as Shota and his team kind of settled on this Japanese Latin hybrid, I was like, this is literally a great restaurant. You should start this tomorrow. I would eat all the food on this menu. And juxtapose that with the Sarah, Chris team just sort of being like, we love seafood. Like, let's do that.
Fish, question mark?
Yeah, right. I think, honestly, if I were ever to go on Top Chef, and I wouldn't, I would just try not to talk about highlighting the flavors of whatever the region is that we are in.
Oh, my God.
Like, because there's so many challenges that are already about that when you get to Restaurant Wars, like, I don't know why you would be like, we just really wanted to highlight Pacific Northwest seafood.
Can you imagine Chris's first quickfire as a contestant, which is showcase the regional ingredients from your home, and you just present Tom with a plate with a single unpeeled potato on it? And you're like,
I would just give
Philadelphia in springtime.
A bag of hers and a Rolling Rock, and I would just be like, thank you, chef.
Thank you, chef. I'll show myself out.
So I definitely think that the proof was in the pudding, like that the one team sort of separated itself from the other early on. But I wanted to ask you one question.
Yeah.
As a sort of competition, do you know much about what happens on the night of Restaurant Wars? Like, are the judges eating 14 dishes in one night? And how much of a disadvantage of it is it to go second?
It's a great question. I was keenly aware of it this episode because there was no distraction. Like, first of all, they were served more food than they generally are served in a Restaurant War. It had to have taken longer. I mean, I guess it's intimated in past seasons that because of the crush of, random customers and the filming, that it's a very long day regardless. But it felt like they were sitting in that first place for a very long time, talking about things and considering things. I feel like they could have been forgiven if they had broken it up over 2 days and just put one team in a chill room for a day, not able to. But then there would have been the argument that they would have had time to discuss and articulate and change their menu. So anyway, all that is to say, they do it. I mean, they eat all that food. What I was curious about was seeing if the pros, the usual judges, would have an advantage in just gastric survival over like the Amars of the world or the Carries who have never done this before, and probably both because they want to perform well in their duties, but also because some of it was good, may have tragically, overestimated their ability to consume this food at the first restaurant and been struggling in the second. Yet, I
don't know that it mattered.
Dale Taldy not only is like, keep bringing me cups of mezcal at my second restaurant, made it to the last course of the second meal and said, bang me right now with this ice cream course. And I have only one note, Chris. Like, that generally when we watch shows, we've been doing this for so long. I don't know how copious your notes are. Top Chef, sometimes I try to write down the dishes or the order in which things rolled out. I only have one note, and I'd like to share it with you. This was not intentional. I just wrote, Dale at symbol Restaurant Wars was all caps king shit. Because I respected the F out of that. So they ate all that food and then did judges' table.
So
unreal. I couldn't.
I actually, I have some notes here so we could break down like what the teams were. It was Jamie, Shota, Maria, and Byron went first, and they had a Japanese Latin hybrid. They started out with an eggplant with sesame mole. They went into a sockeye salmon with a curry. The standout that looked like I would fly to Portland right now to get the leftovers of this was the tongue sandwich that Maria made with help from
Shota. Hot pot.
Yeah, and then they wrapped it up with this hot pot. It felt like also, crucially, they just understood the specificity of this year's Restaurant Wars and this challenge, which was you are also front of house. So you also need to all be mindful of whether or not the guests have water, whether or not they have sparkling water, whether or not they're entertained. They're all sitting facing you, not facing one another. So conversation is actually incumbent on you to make. And obviously, this is just where Maria slingshot into a new realm. Not only did she make some amazing food, but she clearly did the perfect thing, which was she was attentive and good company, but not intrusive and not like making herself kind of like a distraction from the food. Now, she could have done absolutely anything, and it would have been an improvement over what happened with the next team, who just seemed to ignore that entire part of the competition.
Yeah, let's stay on this first team for a second. There was even, Shota even mentioned it when the teams formed through coin tossing, that sheer cooking ability, I think he was saying this in a polite way. He didn't speak, but he was like, the other team is better.
Yeah.
But we're going to be fun. We're going to be team fun or whatever. I think that it's a sign not only that the show tests people in a variety of ways, and there are skills in the restaurant industry clearly, as on Top Chef, that go beyond just what you can brunoise in a kitchen or how fast you can do it. And that's important to showcase. Maria's performance in this episode, though, and Sarah's downfall was also a reminder of the fact that this is a game. It is a competition show. And there can be quirks of fate, timing, luck, opportunity that will affect the final outcome. I mean, I think over the course of talking about the show, we've often come back to the fact that like the best cooks find a way and win out at the end. And that is generally borne out to be the case over the 18 seasons. But a couple weeks ago, we were like, Maria seems awesome, but she's serving everyone giant bowls of stuff. And it just doesn't seem like she's operating on the same level as some of the other contestants. Go to this week, she's locked in, dialed in, and it's perfect for her skill set. Not just that she's personable to the judges, but that she is a passionate team player who was, additive to every piece of food that went out. I'd also say that the exciting thing about this team, it wasn't just a high watermark for Restaurant Wars, as Tom said. It was kind of a beautiful expression of what the show has become. Because fusion as a word is kind of a dirty word in restaurant kitchens, and this wasn't that. It was Shota doing very technical, very tradition-driven Japanese meal construction and being open-hearted enough to be like, what would really be exciting would be to put a mole under this. That's not, or put a sandwich course in the middle of it. That is not kaiseki cuisine, but he's using the understanding of a progression of a meal and his experience doing this stuff to be like, that might be better. That might be exciting. And it was really, I find it moving. I found their meal moving.
He also exerted a level of, at least from my viewpoint, a level of control without being an asshole about it. I think that is something that obviously all workplaces are grappling with, this idea of like, can you be kind of like this occultish sort of boss? Can you run like this sort of workplace committed to like utmost excellence in a high pressure situation without also being kind of a domineering asshole about it. And, you know, I would suggest that you can very easily, but the kitchen is one of the places in American labor where it's like that. They're still catching up to that idea. And most of the people that we're seeing, even on this iteration of Top Chef, have probably come up in a kitchen environment where somebody's yelling at them on the line, right? Like that is in all likelihood, like the kind of environment that they have kind of come through. And they are the ones who are changing the way probably kitchens work. And I just thought that Shota very calmly was like, this will work if we do it this way. I have done this kind of service before, so this is how it can go. And then everyone else in that team was able to express themselves within those parameters.
I think that's exactly right. I just read Bill Buford, the New Yorker writer's new book, Dirt, which is about him moving with his family to Lyon, France, in the pursuit of not just like the origins of French food, but to become a French chef, like in his late 50s, early 60s, living there for 5 years and going into the brigade system. And you know, to compare American kitchens and French kitchens is basically Bane talking to Batman. You know, those dudes were born in the dark. Yeah. You know what I mean? And it's not just the severity and intensity of the kitchens as he describes them when he goes to work in a starred Michelin restaurant. It's the absolute mask on, mask off, not in a COVID sense, of life and work that is normalized there. Wherein he could be sitting at a table on a weekend, if he runs into the head chef of the restaurant and his sous chef, they'll invite him over and like order a magnum of wine and talk to him. The next day, if his peeled potatoes, sorry, Chris, cover your ears, aren't perfectly consistent, they will just turn to him, throw them at the wall, and be like, these are shit, you are shit, get out of my sight until you are a dead corpse, basically. Like you are nothing.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It's not okay, but it is so normalized. And so the extremity of that, I mean, we're not that far away from that kind of behavior being what you do and how you learn. And then later you're like, well, I appreciate that you threw that fruit at me, sir. Like, thank you for it. And so it actually kind of probably is important for that modeling, for Shota to be like a quiet, steady cheerleader. That was so different than what we saw on the other team, which was just mercenary style.
Yeah.
You know? Not because they're bad people.
No, not at all.
Because
I mean,
I think weren't.
Well, also, I think what happened on the other team is that there was no not even a hierarchical system. There was just no decision making going on. And you know, I obviously I love Dawn, so it was like for most of this episode, I was like, oh shit, Dawn hasn't decided what to make. And like, let's be real. Dawn left it pretty late to like. She was still like, I'm waiting to be inspired as like people were like into the third and fourth courses of cooking.
Dawn's performance was incredible because it was an individual triumph. I mean, that was wild also, and really kind of interesting too, to see her creative process, how opaque it is and how she's at peace with it because something emerges, right? Like that's kind of amazing.
Yes.
That said, it was disastrous for a team challenge.
As was Gabe from Texas kind of deciding to do the amuse-bouche that was going to be not palate destroying, but like a huge serving of food, a large serving of food coming before the first course that obviously set the judges table off on the wrong foot.
And here's where you see, I don't think this is exactly what you and Sean were discussing, but at that moment, you didn't need a villain, but you needed someone to step up and say, this is a bad idea. This is not an amuse-bouche. This is not in sync with what we're doing. And then, you know, the way the game has a tendency to find you or find your weaknesses. One thing about Sarah this whole season has been beautiful, exciting, oddball food, but emerging from someone who did not present herself with, she always seems almost surprised to be there. Like she just stumbled into this, and her nerves were so apparent in this episode, just from people watching, her lack of self-confidence, her self-questioning. And she made, that halibut dish looked nasty. Mm-hmm. Like just dribbled cream sauce over some fish. That was weird.
Yeah. And then there was the, I can't remember what the other one that she made was.
It was
that
pak
the one
choy with salmon skin.
And that's the one where they were like, where's the salmon?
The fish.
And this has almost like a let them eat cake vibe where you just like toss this stuff on the plate. I think that she was thrown off a little bit by not understanding the progression of the meal because different people were just kind of off on their own, doing their own thing. She obviously, I think, got up to the edge of kind of being like, I would have been better had Dawn made a call earlier on what she was doing.
I thought that was fair. She said that and they still embraced and understood it.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think Dawn was unaware that what she was doing, because she says after like she finally gets it out, it's kind of like somebody who's like, this is going to be the process and this is the way it's going to go. And I know you're not going to love it, but I need to do it this way. And then at the end apologized for like understanding that was probably a chaotic way of doing things. So, I mean, like, look, of that other team, Sarah, Gabe, Dawn, and Chris is probably the person who has been in the most precarious positions throughout the season. So contextually speaking, if you were going to not just do a little, if you weren't just going to say like blind taste test, who had the best and worst food of this group, I think Chris would have found himself maybe drawn into the bottom there.
Except for the ice cream. The
ice cream. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, the Sarah thing was like, she to me, and we've talked about her and Shota being the favorites for quite a while. I don't remember a favorite like that going out at Restaurant Wars.
Except for last night's judge, Kristen. That was very instructive that she was there. That was one of the more shocking things to happen over the last few seasons. I mean, that was already 8 seasons ago, hard to believe. But it also led to one of the more stunning and dramatic runs on Top Chef, where she basically hand fought her way out of the underworld like a vengeful Orpheus and emerged in the finale and just housed everyone, including Brooke, who would later win, who would win a later season. So that was interesting to see. I don't know how many episodes are left of Last Chance Kitchen before someone's back. It could be as many as 4 or 5, which makes it very challenging to do, but doable. And depending on her level of nerves and who falls out of the competition, she is in a position to do what a few people have done before. I would not count that out. We are recording this, obviously, before Last Chance Kitchen has premiered. She may already be out by the time you hear it. I don't think so. But we should do a revised power rankings. I think there's a clear number one.
Yeah, I think Shota is still the number one in the clubhouse.
Shota's absolutely clubhouse favorite. Dawn coming up fast, which is something you should say about an Olympian.
So food-wise, like this episode to me was about the difference between eating and dining. You know, like there were so many things that went into that first team's win that had to do with like these little touches. You know, like this, like making sure that the meal took one step and then the next step and then the next step and got from A to B. And also making sure that your diners were happy along the way. And even when there might be a misstep in terms of coursing or progression, I think that was sort of the sting was taken out because there was somebody there to be like, can I fill up your glass? How you doing? Make a little joke about what they're doing. As soon as things started going wrong for the second team, it was made that much worse by the fact that the judges had no one else to talk to but themselves to be like, they're fucking up over there. They're messing up. So yeah, I think Shota's there. I think Dawn, I think it might be the edit that she's getting, but they have like that. They've definitely obviously like made it clear that she is an amazing chef who can get in her own head. And in a finale kind of situation, I don't know if she can pull off the, I'm just going to wait for the ingredients to speak to me thing when it's like, no, make me the perfect meal.
But once they speak to each other, they're singing. I mean, dude, what she's coming up with.
I'm definitely cheering for her. So it's not a matter of not wanting it.
Last thing I would throw in there is Byron is surprising me.
Yeah, Byron's good.
He came in with this really big resume. I think he worked at 11 Madison Park.
He did, yeah. Pre-Vegs.
And then, what's that?
Pre-vegan.
Before I went Vegs.
Yeah.
So he was very impressive on paper, but he didn't really distinguish himself so much in the first few weeks. His technical skills are really impressive. And the thing about the show that they've gotten so good at is revealing people's character and spirit and, you know, who they are underneath it. And his phone call with his parents was very moving. That has nothing to do with whether he'll win or not, but it did. The quieting of the season, fewer and fewer people in the kitchen, is allowing him to stand out more. And I think that his ability, sometimes people catch fire at the right time. And so I would put him in the top 5 now as well, along with Gabe, Shota, Dawn, and
we only got 7 people left. So Chris and Jamie would be the last 2. Then.
So Jamie would be the next person, I think. I think Chris got lucky because he made a good ice cream.
All right. Well, we can wrap it up there. We can get into my interview with Ron Moore. Andy and I will be back on Monday with Mayor of Easttown Talk. I'm really excited for the last 2 episodes, and we've got some cool guests lined up, hopefully, for the rest of that show's run. Until then, have a great weekend, everybody.
Great interview, Baranski.
This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. New Year's resolutions are fun the first couple of weeks. Then you kind of maybe conveniently forget about them halfway through January. No shame. It happens to us all. But this year I have a foolproof plan, at least when it comes to saving money. Just switch to Mint Mobile and you're done. Goal accomplished, because for a limited time, their wireless plans are $15 a month when you buy a 3-month plan. The great thing about Mint Mobile is there's no jaw-dropping monthly bills or unexpected overages, and all plans come with unlimited talk and text. Get this new customer offer today at mintmobile.com/watch. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. So I'm so excited to be joined on the Watch podcast by Ron Moore, who is responsible for one of my favorite shows of all time in Battlestar Galactica, and one of the best shows currently on the air, of 2021, For All Mankind. Its 2nd season aired this year. And Ron, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure.
I was wondering whether or not, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around how Apple shows specifically are being received these days, because obviously, like, everybody is sort of processing TV in their own little discrete chambers these days. I was wondering whether or not you noticed a distinctively different response to the 2nd season this year, whether it was critically or whether in terms of fans, because for lack of a better term, it felt like it took a kind of like a leap in some ways.
Yeah, definitely a different response 2nd season, I think, for a variety of reasons. One was when we launched, I tended to see a lot of comment and reviews or just reactions to people to the show that were also talking about Apple as a service and the network, and a lot of the press really reviewed the site. And then we were one of the shows that people would talk about. And I think we kind of got lost in the shuffle to a certain extent. And then people had, thoughts about the first season, and definitely some people not quite understanding what the premise of the show was, or at least where it was going and what the ambition of it was. And didn't seem like history had changed enough for some reviews. Oh, it's too slow and that kind of stuff. And 2nd season, we had made creative changes on the one hand. We also launched at a point where there wasn't a lot of, suddenly there was a lot less content because of the pandemic. Sure. And we sort of had a moment in time where, we kind of had the spotlight to ourselves. And then people, I think, also saw the promise of the show, like, oh, now I get what they're going for. Oh, now it's jumped 10 years. And, oh, I see how these things they set up season 1 are now paying off. And yeah, it's been great. It's been gratifying to sort of see, okay, just give us a little time. You're going to see what we're going for.
I was wondering if you could take me a little bit behind this curtain in terms of what you're going for, because I'm fascinated by how you guys must write this show. And I was wondering whether or not, if to the extent that you're comfortable, could you tell me a little bit about how you sort of balance writing the history of the show and writing the future of the show, and maybe even the past of the show to some extent, with what you want out of the characters and the journeys you want the different characters to go on? Is it bifurcated where there's this sort of like one whiteboard where everything that's happening in the world is sort of happening, and then another whiteboard where the characters are? Or can you just tell me a little bit about what goes into writing the show?
Well, we started with the timeline. Like when the show hadn't even been picked up yet, but we were still conceiving it, developing it, and I was putting the writer's room together. And we had the concept of what the show was, and knew it was going to, go by decades and go into the, start in the past and move down through the years, and to sort of show the scope and the scale of the evolving space program. Because, since the idea was to show the space program we didn't get and to see what could have been possible, you could only really do that if you were willing to jump fairly aggressively through time, because otherwise you would just never get out of the 70s and you'd never get even past really the shuttle era. So it was always sort of set up with this idea it was going to be this sort of generational show. So the first document that I really sat down and wrote was a timeline, a historical timeline, starting with the inciting incident and just kind of literally going through the years and sort of tracking big historical events and changes in the program. And I just kind of did it off the top of my head because I enjoy that kind of thing. I like world building and I like history. So it was a fun puzzle for me to kind of like, okay, well, what's the alternate timeline that we're kind of building from? And after that, and then we kind of built out the framework. And basically, I looked at that timeline not too long ago, and we've stuck to a lot of it. There's some things have changed and some things didn't come to pass, but the general skeleton is still kind of there. In the writer's room, we tend to focus on, a season at a time. Season one, then we sort of, at the very beginning, we mapped out sort of what a 7-year journey would be on the show, like 7 decades worth of general story. Like here's roughly a framework for each of the seasons and some ideas of sort of how it's all going to map out. And then we said, okay, set that aside. Now let's really focus on first season. Second season was the same thing. And basically, you're talking primarily about the characters, what they're going to do this year, what's their individual journey, what's their character arcs, and what have we learned about Baldwin and what's going to happen with Karen and Tracy and all that. And then you're saying, okay, this season, second season, is about the Cold War, and it's going to get to a Cuban Missile Crisis in Space finale. Okay, now let's map onto that where we want to take these characters, right? And so that's kind of the general way we approach it. In terms of the political events and the alternate history, we just kind of do a lot of that on the fly. We talk a lot about in the room. We talk about, okay, what were the important things in this decade? What's the history of the 80s? What do we set up in season one? What are the dominoes that would fall as a result? Well, Ted Kennedy was president, but Ted Kennedy has a sex scandal, and we know Ronald Reagan's going to be president, and it's going to happen 4 years earlier. Okay, how does that affect his administration? What is his focus? Oh, KAL 000 goes down this year. That's perfect for us. Let's work that into the story. And it's just a lot of back and forth with us, with all the writers kind of chiming in and talking about possibilities and what are the pop cultural moments that we can work in, what are the geopolitical things we want to work in, but always kind of bringing it back to, well, how does this affect Baldwin? How does this affect our story? Why do this event? Is it important, or is it something we just put on a TV screen in the background that's just kind of a fun Easter egg about alternate history, or is it something that's going to fit organically and importantly into the story we're telling this year?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I love about this show is that I think that there's a version of this that could be very easily bogged down with the butterfly effect stuff. And in this, it's more like John Lennon lives, but it's sort of more of a thread that goes through the second season as you just kind of see his presence around and his sort of advocacy for peace, which was what he was doing at the end of his life. But it's not something where it's like, well, if John Lennon lived, I mean, what does that mean for Keith Richards and Mick Jagger then? And like this sort of like ripple effect, which I guess the reason why I was asking though is because, there's this romantic notion that you hear writers sometimes talk about where it's just like, well, I just let the characters just sort of tell me where they're going to go. And in this case, I would imagine that there would be this tension of the characters can tell you where they want to go, but then there is also this force of history that you're also contending with that is going to probably impact where those characters want to go.
Yeah, there's definitely a tension between those two ideas as we work through everything, and there's certain events that are important for the show. And then there's just fun things like the John Lennon thing was something I just wanted to do and thought it would be a great little background piece of material, and others sort of passing references or a newspaper headline you might see. And those kind of are all ascribed to sort of the butterfly effect of things kind of being different. Let's have some fun with that. And then other things are really important building blocks historically that then have to intersect with our characters, like Apollo-Soyuz. Oh, here's an idea that was actually in the 70s. Let's work that into our narrative. Okay, how and why would they do something like Apollo-Soyuz in our version of reality? And then you start working through, how that all plays together. But it's definitely, you kind of go back and forth between the character arc and the architecture of the show, which is sort of moving you in a certain direction. It's made a little bit easier by the fact that it's not just a show that's just a general alternate history, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're following a specific group of people in a specific organization. And that organization is providing the organizing principle for the whole series. So it's always been saying, okay, the space program, space exploration, that's our focus in this alternate world. How is the exploration of space in an expanded way driving our story and pulling in? If our characters aren't involved in the space program, they're probably not in the show much.
Right. Do you feel any sort of, I guess speaking of this tension, and obviously the second season it builds up to this incredibly heartbreaking, but also very sweet climax with Gordo and Tracy sacrificing themselves. And you literally have these characters that obviously you're very affectionate towards and viewers develop like this long-standing relationship with, kind of sacrificed at the feet of your history and at the feet of events. Is that different than, say, a character leaving the show or dying off on a series you've worked on that was purely a work of fiction, that was purely kind of just like, oh, it's time, this character has reached the end of their journey, versus this needs to happen because otherwise we've kind of checkmated ourselves into a place where the moon is uninhabitable for thousands of years unless somebody saves this space station?
No, it was actually very similar because we didn't really plan for Tracy and Gordo to die at the end. Like, that wasn't part of the master plan for the series at all, or for even the season. And it wasn't until we were working out the end game of the season, we were working through sort of the story structure of the finale, and we knew we had these three big pieces. You had Pathfinder, Apollo Soyuz, and the confrontation on the moon. And we were talking about how we were going to resolve each of those. And it felt like, there had to be a sacrifice to be made. It felt like a little too easy if everyone just accomplished their mission without anything going wrong. And you start figuring out, well, okay, where could something go wrong, and where could the sacrifice happen? And someone pitched out, well, this crazy run across the moon, maybe Gordo dies in it. And we all kind of, no, that's terrible. We don't want to lose Gordo. And then it was, well, maybe it's not even Gordo. Maybe Tracy takes the run. I don't want to kill Tracy either. Well, what if they both go? Now I really don't want to do it. And there was a lot of resistance, and we all just kind of pushed the idea aside. And it took a few weeks for us the story just kept coming back.
Yeah.
As we were working through the material, it was just the undeniable end. It was a very organic ending, not just to the story, but also to their characters. We kind of took a hard look at Tracy and Gordo and said, well, we had plans for them in season 4. Were they that great? Are we going to tell a better story for the end of Gordo and Tracy than this ending? And we couldn't answer that question other than no. And it was just something you had to kind of face, like, this is the best ending to their story, and it's the best ending to the season, so we should do it. So it really was kind of driven by a very sort of organic kind of process in the writer's room.
Did the actors get a vote there?
They did not. we told them after we'd made the decision, and it's hard to tell an actor something like that, and they were very gracious, and shocked, and but when we explained it to them and what was going to happen and why, they were like, oh, we get it. I totally understand.
Well, I imagine it's a different kind of gig, right? It's not really like Ozark that's going to be this compressed story about these people doing this one thing and if they get out or not. And there's obviously death is sort of always around the corner. This is the most fascinating part about this project to me is the idea that it's a generational story, and that the For All Mankind that we will probably get when this show is over will be comprised of all likelihood, a totally different cast. I mean, it's almost baked into the gig, isn't it? Yeah.
It is. I mean, that was something we talked about at the inception. I've never seen this structure done before, really, on an ongoing series. And actually, the only reference I had, which really no one else in the room even knew, was there was a miniseries called Centennial that aired in the 1980s, which I saw and I loved when I was in high school or whenever I saw it. And it was based on a James Michener book. And it basically told the story of this town of Centennial, Colorado, starting from the dinosaurs. And it was a centennial story, a generational story. And it was fascinating to get attached to characters, watch them grow old, then see their children supplant them in the narrative, and then happen all over again. And I knew that as a theory, it could work. But no one else had ever seen anything like that. And it was sort of a big challenge to try to make that, okay, let's really do this as an ongoing television series.
You've obviously had experience in a bunch of different very important phases of TV history. And I was curious, as you're sort of embarking on this very adventurous idea of telling a story that is actually going to, step by step walk through this alternate history. This almost seems in some ways it's old fashioned because it's imagining a show that goes on for quite some time, but it's almost very progressive at this time because you do see so many shows that are limited series, or even if they're not, they behave like limited series and the amount of plot that they burn in any given episode or so. Do you see yourself as sort of like doing something that goes against the tide with this, or is this actually a pretty traditional idea?
No, it did feel like we were doing something that was different. We felt that in the room a lot as we were doing structure, and we just were like, wow. I mean, you'd catch yourself and going, yeah, but next season they're going to be 10 years older, and oh wait, that's a whole different thing. And a lot of these characters, some of them we may leave behind at some point. Oh, that's going to be hard. The setting's going to change. On a production challenge, it's like, oh yeah, we have to reinvent the sets every year, and the costumes, and everything has to kind of change. It's like you're creating almost a new show every season. And so there's a lot of challenges associated with that none of us had ever faced, which is exciting and scary, all at the same time.
As you get closer to, I obviously the season would comprise a lot of events that you were present for and that you were a spectator for. As you move through your own life as this story is being told, do you find your relationship to the story changing a little bit because of where you were, say, in the early 80s or in the 90s for season 3?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. I mean, it's rooted very much in my own experience, because I was like 5 years old when Apollo 11 happened, and I have a memory of Apollo 11, but it's at the primeval part of my memory, right? And as the series goes on, you're moving through just kind of my memory of the 70s and pop culture and music, and strongly in the 80s. In the 80s, that's very present for me still. And now we're talking about the 90s and so on. And it is kind of going back over the course of my life, like in a very odd way.
Do you find yourself seeing parts of yourself in any of the characters?
Yeah, all of them in different ways. I mean, I've always sort of felt that on all the shows I've worked on. There's never been really a particular character that is really a stand-in for me, but they all have aspects of my personality or things I've thought about or things I felt or experienced or happened to family members. So I kind of see myself in pieces of almost all of them.
I saw that in another interview you mentioned that you try not to watch sci-fi when you're making sci-fi, that you try not to take on sci-fi when you're making anything that could be called sci-fi. What do you watch when making For All Mankind? What kind of odd stuff winds up influencing this? I was curious whether you watch things from the late 60s, early 70s, or the 80s that might be on in the background of these people's lives, or is there an odd influence here that we wouldn't know unless we talk to you?
No, nothing. I mean, I thought when I started on this project in particular that I'd end up playing a lot of period music or something while I was writing. And that just ended up distracting me. And so I don't even do that. I sort of really separate my relaxation time from my work time, unless there's something I really have to watch for work or a specific reference. Or I went back and watched a lot of episodes of the Bob Newhart show because I wrote that episode in season 1. But that was work, right? It wasn't really kind of inspiring me and giving me ideas. It was like, okay, this is a homework assignment I had to go do. So there wasn't really anything in particular that I've been watching that really influenced it, other than, I'm always watching an episode or two of Seinfeld, so there's always odd Seinfeld references and influences in probably everything I do,
I think that would be pretty surprising for most people to hear if they've watched your work. Do you feel like this is sort of a two-parter, but I think I really respond to the fact that even though it's a period piece, the visual language and the sort of look of the show feels very contemporary, but it also feels very discreet from it. It doesn't feel like it's got Amblin lens flares or overly done visual nods to a certain era. Do you think, though, as the show goes on, that you could imagine a For All Mankind that looks drastically different as much as it might feature different characters?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's part of the language of what we're doing. I mean, we started doing subtle things in season 2, even in terms of outer space photography. If you look back at season 1, we were very careful to never show the stars while you're in space, because the cameras in real space just can't really actually photograph them. There's too much contrast. If you see an astronaut, you see the space vehicle in foreground, you never see the stars in background. And the only time we ever broke that in season 1 was when we did a pan up shot from Deke's grave up to the stars. And we kind of felt like, well, as you left the lunar surface and the bright contrast, that suddenly you would see the stars come out. Season 2, we started breaking that a little bit more. There were certain sequences in cinematography, especially around the dark side of the moon and Pathfinder, looking out the windows, you started to see stars. And we said to ourselves, well, that's in some ways, indicative of the fact that the technology of the show is portraying is accelerating at a faster pace. And so we kind of talked generally about, as the show evolved, you could start doing different saturation levels. You could start playing around a little bit with the cinematography that would also give you a sense of time and change and moving from one era to another.
That's so cool. Yeah, I think that, the outer space sequences especially, I think I can see what you're talking about, because a lot of the Houston stuff, I think is actually like, it feels very grounded in a way that, is almost, when you go to space, it feels special, visually it feels special. You kind of know that you're somewhere else. I know that your relationship to the show is changing a little bit as you move to do stuff with Disney. What would be like the sort of major change to like your day-to-day work on the show?
Oh, it's just that it's no longer day to day. I mean, it's,
Okay.
I'm not the day to day showrunner anymore. Matt and Ben are who I co-created the show with. And that was always kind of the intention. And day to day show running is a very intense process, especially in the first year, because in the first year, as the showrunner, you're making all key decisions that influence everything kind of all the time. Well, what color, are we using? What's our color palette? Oh, what's the style of the music? What's the editorial thing? Does the character do this and the character do that? And you're making like fundamental choices all through the first season that then imprint themselves on what the series is. Now, as you get into the second, third, and hopefully beyond seasons, you have fewer of those fundamental choices to make, right? And you can hand it off to somebody else who's like now going to take it and make all the same. There's lots of day-to-day stuff, casting, budget meetings, scheduling, that are really the hard work, breaking every story in detail in the writer's room. Now they can carry that and I'll go do something else.
Do you get a kick out of that day-to-day work still?
I do at times. Yeah. The first season is really engaging and really fun because it's all new territory. It's all doing something for the first time. Second season is like, okay, let's do it again. Let's do it again and again. And it's not quite as much fun on the second season, just because you've done the fun. I mean, this particular show is a little unique in that you are kind of reinventing it every year. So there's still a little bit of pizzazz in what's the 1980s version of the show, right? But yeah, I get tired of budget meetings and I get tired of production meetings after a while. I've done so many of them down through the years that I don't miss that aspect of the job. What I do miss is I miss being in the writer's room with the writers every single day. That's the most fun of the job. That and editorial, where you're in the cutting room with the editors. And I've tried to preserve those two ends, like the beginning and the end are still the places I have the most participation. I do sit in some of the writer's room conversations. I still read scripts and I still come in at the end and work on the cut, and everything in between I kind of have walked away from.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I would imagine that like the 13th time you're sort of chatting about what should be on what shelf in the bar, in Houston, you probably are like, yeah, I got it. Yeah. I'm on the record.
Yeah, it's like, okay.
The last question I wanted to ask you is just about the nature of the ensemble, which we've sort of noted is in flux and can change over the course of the seasons. But I think a lot of TV now is geared around sort of primary lead performances, like 1, 2, maybe 3 people who are really driving shows. And the thing that I love about Mankind is that you can make the argument that any number of half a dozen people are like the protagonist of the show in some ways. And I guess I was going to ask you, do you feel like that's sort of becoming a lost art, is writing for an ensemble in that way? And have you heard any kind of feedback about what certain characters might mean to people when they see them on the screen?
I guess I hadn't thought about the fact that the ensemble is a dying breed. I mean, I never really thought about it like that. But I guess you're right. I guess as I think through shows, there are less of them. I mean, Game of Thrones is certainly a big ensemble with lots of characters that you would highlight, depending on what the story was. I like that a lot. I think a lot of that came from not just Star Trek, but also Battlestar, where we had a core group of characters at the very beginning and a lot of sort of, what started out as secondary supporting roles. And bit by bit, we just kept expanding the definition of the show and increasing the size of the family. And it just made the world richer and it made the stories richer. And I got a lot of enjoyment as a creator out of that. And so doing the same thing in Mankind was just fun. Here's the core group, but let's keep expanding. Let's keep, including those people that just showed up for an episode and they felt like a guest star, but let's show Irene Hendricks again. Let's and Bill Strasser. Let's keep the whole family together, even as we're moving through a generational style.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Well, yeah, I hear a lot of comment on people who identify with certain characters or who don't like certain characters.
Yeah.
You always get sort of those two reactions of the people. I really don't like him or her. And then, oh my God, I just love, him. And certainly when Gordo and Tracy went down, suddenly it was like all these Gordo Tracy people came out of the woodwork.
Sure.
Where everyone, people I had spoken to people about the show, just friends of mine or acquaintances many times. And there were people that had never even mentioned Gordo and Tracy. Suddenly they were like, oh my God, they were my favorite characters.
Yeah, it's Jack and Rose on the Titanic or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Like suddenly, like, really? I never heard you even mention Gordo and Tracy before now, but now they're your favorite characters.
Well, public opinion's a powerful thing. Ron, thank you so much for joining me, man. I won't take you in more time. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm such a huge fan of your work on the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Watch. As always, we are produced by Kaya McMullen, and we'll be back with you next Monday.